500 years ago, Christmas was a pretty wild party. Young men would get drunk, and they'd roam in packs around town, terrifying the townspeople and demanding alcohol. And you really didn't know what they might do if you didn't give them alcohol. 200 years ago, Christmas wasn't celebrated at all in most of the United States, and parents didn't give gifts to children. 100 years ago, the Santa Claus myth was invented. Well, I guess I should say it was reinvented, but I'll tell you about that later. And the Santa myth came with the elves and the workshop and the sleigh and the reindeer and all that. In this episode of The Science of Creativity, you'll learn the history of the secular, non-religious traditions that we celebrate at Christmas. All of us in the United States and Europe played a role in the creation of Christmas. It started 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome. It picked up steam in the 1800s, and we're still creating new Christmas traditions today. The creation of Christmas is a story of social innovation and group genius. Stay tuned for the creation story of Christmas. Welcome to the special Christmas episode of The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. The creation of Christmas is an example of what I call social innovation. It's a kind of collective creativity where everyone plays a role. My mission in this podcast is to inspire you with stories of brilliant creators and world-changing inventions. You'll hear interviews with leading innovators and creativity researchers, and sometimes you'll hear episodes like this one, where I tell stories about some of the most important and interesting creations. If you like this episode, please click like, and please subscribe to the show. I hope you'll share the show and leave a comment. This will help people like you learn about the show. You can listen to The Science of Creativity on all platforms and at sawyerpodcast.com. We usually don't think about where holidays come from. None of us were there to see it happen. Our grandparents did it the same way then that we do it now. But the Christmas holiday and its traditions were created by previous generations over the centuries. In this episode, I tell you how and when it happened. Christmas was created before your grandparents were born, but Christmas wasn't created by a single person. No one created Christmas all by themselves. I think that's one reason it seems strange to talk about the creation of Christmas, because creativity seems like something that solitary people do. It doesn't seem like an invention. You can't get a patent on Christmas. But creativity isn't just about one person having brilliant ideas and getting a patent on them. A lot of human creativity is a social and collective phenomenon. It's what I call group genius. The story of Christmas is a story of collaboration, of social networks, and of historical creation and evolution over time. Christmas wasn't invented by a marketing genius, but marketing geniuses played a role. Christmas wasn't scripted by a famous author, but famous authors played a role too. Uncountable people played a role in creating Christmas over hundreds of years. The creation story of Christmas is a story about how we worked and made money. It's about changes in families and childhood, and it's about changes in how toys were made. Traditions have a lot of stability through history, but still, they change over time, just really slowly. It takes more than one lifetime, so for you and me, we don't see a lot of change. Before people were literate, and before we had historians that wrote books that we read hundreds of years later, no one had any way of knowing whether traditions changed over time or not. Before we had books to read about the past, there was no way to analyze changes over the centuries. But once a culture invents writing and invents books, the field of history becomes possible, and we're able to analyze change over long periods of time. I'm a creativity researcher, and to prepare for this episode, I read a lot of books about the history of Christmas. I saw stories of cultural creativity, of collective invention. When you look at these traditions at the scale of 100 years or more, you see that many things change. Traditions are always changing. For this story, I'll take you back 200 years to the early 1800s. I'll take you back 500 years to the 1500s, and I'll even take you back 2,000 years to the ancient Romans. During all of these centuries, Christmas kept changing, and it's still changing today. This is a story about the secular, non-religious traditions of Christmas. It's not a story about Christianity or about Jesus' birth. Those stories are in the Christian Bible, and we know that's where they came from. And some Christian churches have their own rituals and traditions around Christmas. But this invention story is about the things that are not in the Bible, and that is a lot of things about Christmas. tree with lights, reindeer pulling a sleigh, elves making toys, kissing under the mistletoe, decorating trees, decorating your house with wreaths and garlands, stockings left by the fireplace to fill, leaving out snacks for Santa Claus overnight. If your family has their own family traditions, please type them in the comments. One of my favorite things about Christmas is the Charlie Brown Christmas Special. That's the 1965 animated cartoon with the jazz music by Vince Guaraldi. In the show, Charlie Brown is depressed. He wonders what the meaning of Christmas is. He's surrounded by commercialism, bright lights, advertisements, and he can't believe that no one else seems upset by this. I think the reason the show stays popular, even though it's decades later, it's because it reveals a truth about Christmas. After all, this tension is very real. Christmas is definitely commercial. People are buying and giving gifts, they're shopping at stores. Stores are advertising sales, the television ads have Santa Claus and his sleigh. But at the same time, we feel like Christmas is special in a deeper way, in an uncommercial way. The story of how Christmas was invented helps us explain what was going on with Charlie Brown. It helps us explain why we feel this tension at Christmas. When I went back to study the history of Christmas, I found out what was going on. I found out that the tension is at the core of the Christmas story, and it goes back hundreds of years. When this winter holiday was first invented, it wasn't a Christian holiday. Many scholars say that if you read the New Testament really closely, Jesus would have been born in the spring, not in the winter, probably sometime in mid-April. The Catholic Church in Rome chose the date of December 25th to celebrate the birth, partly to absorb the traditions of an existing pagan festival, Saturnalia, which was in the Roman Empire in Italy. Saturnalia took place on the day of the winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year, December 21st. Saturnalia was a holiday where people got drunk and they exchanged gifts. Drinking has been a big part of Christmas for thousands of years, and the Greek god Dionysus, who is the god of wine, he was celebrated with a festival in December. You can find lots of clues today about how much Christmas is associated with drinking alcohol. Listen closely to the lyrics of many Christmas carols. One of them has the title, "Here We Come A-Wassailing." If you've heard that word wassailing, you might have learned that it's an old term for singing carols door to door. That's true, but it was a special kind of caroling. In England in the Middle Ages, in the 1600s, in wassailing, groups of people would walk from door to door and they'd sing songs in the expectation that the owner would answer the door and give them a drink of alcoholic punch from a very large goblet that was called the wassail bowl. It was a punch that was mulled wine or spiced ale. Rowdy bands of young men, they would make a point of going to the rich people's houses. Then they would demand food and drink. They would be singing, but they'd also be shouting and banging pots and pans, and even sometimes firing shotguns. If for some reason the host didn't give this band of young men a drink, the roving band would get angry. They'd shout curses at the owner. Sometimes they'd vandalize his house. That's even in the lyrics to the song "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." It's in the line, "We won't go until we get some, so bring some out here." Now that's obviously a threat, right? It was essentially like trick-or-treat for adults, but with alcohol instead of candy. I went and found some synonyms for wassail in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Carouse, binge, revel, as in revelry. Here's how to use wassailing in a sentence according to the dictionary. Quote, "The knights feasted and wassailed for 3 days after their battlefield victory," unquote. So you can see wassailing didn't even have to be associated with Christmas anytime you wanted to drink a lot. As you can imagine, Christian people thought this wassailing tradition was evil. Christmas in those days was the opposite of Christian. The Christians cracked down on all of this partying in the 1600s, when England was ruled by Oliver Cromwell and a Puritan parliament. That was 1649 to 1660. And the celebration of Christmas was banned in 1645. They said it was a popish festival with no biblical justification. The word popish meant the Catholic Pope in Rome, and when Protestants said it, popish was an insult, and Protestants ran England at that time. Those Puritans knew that most elements of this traditional winter celebration, like the Christmas trees and the candles and the holly and the mistletoe, they knew they were pagan in origin. In fact, churches were ordered to remain closed on December 25th, and traditional decorations like holly and ivy were actually outlawed. Puritans brought this anti-Christmas attitude to America when they arrived in the Massachusetts colony in 1620, and they actually banned Christmas there too. Most of Europe didn't become Christian immediately after the year 0 when Jesus was born. Of course, that couldn't happen. It took a long time for Christianity to be established and to spread across Europe and the Middle East. When the Catholic priests moved in across Europe, they built the churches. The people who lived there already had their traditions and beliefs, and the gods that predated Christianity. The word pagan is used to describe these pre-Christian beliefs. Another example of a pagan holiday is called Yule, and it was celebrated by Norse people in Northern Europe. Yule was 12 days of feasting and drinking. We have a Christmas carol for that, and it's called the 12 Days of Christmas. And you might have heard about the Yule log, which is a log that burns in the fireplace. But people don't give up their holidays and their traditions very easily. So they'd go to the Christian church and they'd pray to Jesus, but then they'd return home and they'd celebrate their old pagan customs. So if people in England were celebrating the winter solstice on December 21st, it was a real challenge for the church to try to completely ban the holiday. So instead, the church came up with a new strategy. They just gave the holiday a different name, and they gave it a Christian theme. Christianity absorbed the pagan traditions and symbols that already existed, but it gave them a new meaning. People have always exchanged gifts in late December all the way back to the pre-Christian Romans, so the church would have had a really difficult time stopping that custom. Instead, the church co-opted the tradition. They blended in the biblical story of the 3 wise men who traveled to Bethlehem to give gifts to baby Jesus. The technical term for this kind of merger, when a new church comes in and absorbs old customs, is syncretism, and it happens all over the world whenever a new religion moves into a country for the first time. For the most part, the Christian Christmas traditions that we know today were around before Christianity, or they developed separately from it. Many of them were absorbed into the Christian church, and many of them remain secular, like the Yule log, or kissing under the mistletoe, or getting drunk. Most of modern Christmas was created recently, over a 100-year period from the 1800s to the 1900s, when this primarily pagan holiday and its pagan traditions was woven into mainstream U.S. society. Until the mid-1800s, Christmas wasn't celebrated in many parts of the United States. The story of the Nativity wasn't taught in most Protestant Sunday schools until the 1850s. That's the story where Jesus was born in a manger with sheep and donkeys on December 25th. It was only between 1837 and 1890 that individual U.S. states began to recognize Christmas as a legal holiday. And in 1870, the U.S. Congress made it an official federal holiday. The holiday that we celebrate today was influenced by a mid-Victorian revival that was in the mid-1800s, and it was heavily influenced by the author Charles Dickens. In 1843, Dickens published a story that became famous, A Christmas Carol. It was released on December 19th, and it sold out by Christmas Eve. It's never been out of print. The story features a business owner named Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge hated Christmas and he treated his employees badly. One night, his dead business partner came back as a ghost, and he introduced Scrooge to 3 spirits: Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future. They each took Scrooge on a journey, and by the end of the 3rd journey with Christmas future, Scrooge was scared out of his miserly ways, and he woke up to the value of Christmas. He made donations to charity. He gave gifts. He became happy. Scrooge found grace when he learned to share his wealth through gift giving. After about 1820, giving toys to children at Christmas became more common. The toys were handmade by the parents because there were no toys to buy at that time. Very few toys were manufactured in the United States until after the Civil War. On the farm, after the harvest was done in the fall, farm families had lots of spare time. A child's Christmas present was lovingly crafted by the parents. But as U.S. society became increasingly successful economically in the 19th century, giving gifts to children became a way of demonstrating a family's affluence. So parents increasingly purchased toys rather than making them. There are several reasons for why they did that. First of all, industrialism expanded and toys became mass-produced more cheaply. Second, international trade expanded, especially with Germany, where many toys were made, and they brought higher quality toys. They were better than a farm family could make by hand, that's for sure. Third reason is that Americans lost the craft skills needed to make the toys. Americans were increasingly taking factory and office jobs, and those jobs were year-round, so the people lost the skills of using tools and working by hand. They no longer had the post-harvest spare time that they needed to make their own toys. After all, when you're working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day in the factory, there's no time left over to make toys. Buying toys solved all of these problems. But parents felt guilty about buying a manufactured toy. They still thought that the job of parents was to make toys themselves. Like I said, traditions die very slowly, right? When the parents had been children in the 1820s, nothing communicated their parents' love like a handmade toy. So when they bought a toy at a store for their own kids, it felt like they were cheating somehow. So how did the parents resolve this moral conflict? How could you be a loving parent if you bought the toys? The tradition was that toys were supposed to be handmade, not manufactured, but parents were buying toys from factories which just didn't feel right to them. The tension was resolved by a brilliant cultural invention, Santa Claus. Santa Claus to the rescue. Santa Claus plus his elves and his workshop at the North Pole. The invention of Santa Claus resolved the ambivalence that parents felt about buying manufactured toys instead of handmade toys. It's because the Santa myth disguised the commercial origin of toys. Santa had legions of happy elves, and they were hand-making the toys. So picture Santa's factory with the elves. They're working at long tables in rows. They're making toys by hand, like in the movie Elf, or in the children's TV show Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So what does that image remind you of? Of any other factory, of course, with low-paid labor doing boring, repetitive tasks 12 hours a day without breaks. Did the elves get paychecks? Probably not. Did they belong to a union? Definitely not. But with their singing and their charming red and green elf outfits, it makes capitalism look like fun. Everybody's happy making toys for the children. But Santa Claus didn't start out this way. He originated as St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas was the patron saint of children, prostitutes, and the poor. He lived during the 4th century, and his myth was that he gave gifts to children and the poor. He had a long beard and a large cloak. He was pretty thin. And then, because of industrialization, Santa Claus began to change. In 1875, F.A.O. Schwartz, which was a big famous toy store in New York, F.A.O. Schwartz used a costumed Santa Claus to promote toy sales. Santa Claus was in their advertisements in magazines and newspapers. This ad campaign was a huge success. The store hired a man with an impressive beard to perform as Santa Claus, and families brought their children to meet him. By the 1890s, the other department stores copied the idea, and Santa was in every big city department store. By the 1920s, stores were putting out press releases announcing Santa's arrival in town from the North Pole, and the kids lined up to visit. Santa became the star of the Macy's Day Parade, which was first held on Thanksgiving Day in 1924. The myth of Santa Claus helped U.S. culture to resolve the tension between the magic of childhood innocence and the reality of commercialism, of industry, and affluence. In Europe, instead of Santa Claus, they had Father Christmas and St. Nicholas. These two were dramatically different from today's Santa Claus. In England, Father Christmas did not give the gifts. In many other European countries, it was the Christ child who delivered the gifts to the young. In Mexico, it was traditionally the baby Jesus, or the 3 wise men who brought the toys. Santa Claus is largely a U.S. invention. Clement Moore from New York City wrote his poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, in 1822. The American cartoonist Thomas Nast first was the one who sketched Santa as a jolly fat man. That was in 1863. But before that, Santa Claus looked like Father Christmas, tall and thin. A famous advertising campaign by Coca-Cola that started in 1931 gave us the Santa Claus we have today. He had a jolly nature and red cheeks. That was by illustrator Haddon Sundblom. That Santa Claus looks more like Bacchus, the god of revelry and drinking, than like the thin, gaunt Father Christmas of Europe. Kind of like Wassailing or Saturnalia, where drinking alcohol has long been a part of Christmas. A few years ago, I was on a worldwide speaking tour, and in November, I was giving talks in both Malaysia and Hong Kong. I was really surprised to find that Christmas was everywhere. The mall speakers were playing Frank Sinatra, singing songs like Jingle Bells. and Vince Guaraldi's jazz piano from the Charlie Brown Christmas special. Christmas trees and lights were everywhere. And these aren't Christian countries. Malaysia is a Muslim country. Hong Kong is primarily Buddhist. But now that I've told you the real story about the invention of Christmas, you can figure out why it's been so easy to celebrate Christmas without Christ. Because the Christmas holiday and its traditions predate Christianity in Europe, and they're largely secular. The midwinter celebration was largely unrelated to Christian doctrine until the late 19th century. The Bible doesn't specify a date or even a season for Jesus' birth. Scholars think it was probably in the spring, actually, because that fits with the New Testament better. These are some reasons that the Puritans rejected the holiday, and that they thought it wasn't based in the Bible, and that it was theologically incorrect. Think about all of our most popular Christmas carols. They're pretty much all non-religious, with titles like White Christmas, and Rudolph, and Sleigh Bells, and I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, and All I Want for Christmas is My Two Front Teeth. The songwriters did this on purpose. They didn't accidentally leave out Jesus Christ. They wanted songs that would work for all Americans. I'm 64 years old, so I still remember that around 20 years ago, in the United States, people were concerned about what they called the war on Christmas. It was, according to some conservative commentators, that there was an anti-religious but a sneaky and secret plan to remove Jesus Christ from the holiday. The phrase "the war on Christmas" was popularized by conservative commentators in the early 2000s, like Bill O'Reilly. These conservative commentators cited a lot of evidence that there was a war on Christmas. What they meant was a war on the Christian parts of Christmas. Their evidence included lawsuits against Christian symbols in public, like on town squares or in front of a city town hall. For example, some people sued cities to remove the nativity scene from public property. The nativity scene was a representation of Jesus' birth, and that's obviously a Christian symbol. So if you're wondering what the problem with that is, well, because in America we have what's called a separation of church and state. So the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, who brought some of the lawsuits, they argued that government-funded displays of Christian symbols are a violation of the Constitution. The Constitution has a ban on the establishment of a national religion, and it's called the Establishment Clause of the Constitution. The ACLU claim was that having these Christian symbols on public property, on city property, it violated the U.S. Constitution because the Constitution bans the government from having an official national religion. So yeah, that's what we call the separation of church and state. So another piece of evidence that there was a war on Christmas, or a war on the Christian parts of Christmas, according to these conservative critics, in some product advertisements, companies would use this four-letter word Xmas, X-M-A-S, instead of spelling out Christmas. So Xmas was attacked in 1966 by Gerald L.K. Smith. He called it a blasphemous omission of the name of Christ. Smith even attacked Santa Claus for being anti-Christian. I guess he's got a point, after all. No one thinks that Santa was in Bethlehem when Jesus Christ was born, so why is he everywhere in December? That's what Smith wanted to know. He claimed that Santa Claus was invented to suppress the story of Jesus' birth. Conservatives also saw evidence of the war on Christmas anytime someone tried to avoid saying Merry Christmas. Instead, they said Happy Holidays or Season's Greetings. Big stores like Walmart and Target downplayed the word Christmas, and instead they would say holidays. And they've had mixed policies over the years about whether it's okay to say things like, "We're counting down the days to Christmas," because it has Christmas in it. In 2006, a Best Buy spokesperson, Dawn Bryant, said, quote, "We're going to continue using the term holiday and not Christmas because there are several holidays throughout that time period, and we certainly need to be respectful of all of them," unquote. In the 1990s, California called their public trees holiday trees instead of Christmas trees, and some other states did this too. But now, you know that there have been wars on Christmas for hundreds of years, long before Santa Claus came into the picture. But those older wars, way back in the 1600s, they were waged by Christians. The Christians were against the holiday, and that was for 200 years, from the 1600s through the 1800s. During those years, Christian people did not celebrate Christmas. So there's always been a tension surrounding the holiday of Christmas. And I'm happy to call it Christmas. States like California, which banned the word Christmas, they should listen to this episode so they'd find out that the holiday used to be rejected by Christians because of all of its non-Christian symbols. I love all of the Christmas holiday traditions. I actually really like fruitcake, which makes me different from most people. I'm not really a huge fan of the tradition that you're supposed to kiss somebody who's standing under the mistletoe, but the Christmas holiday is filled with fun and wonderful and fascinating traditions. Historians know a lot about the origins of our most popular traditions, like the trees and the gift giving. Oh, and I forgot to mention eggnog, another one of my favorite customs. And then there are all the decorations, like the candles in every window, or you put a garland along your stair rail, and of course, decorations all over your Christmas tree. There are so many customs I haven't even had time to mention, like the tradition of mailing end of year cards to our friends and families. Some people keep the cards they've received from past years, and then they string them up to display them the next year. Many families have their own unique traditions that partly define who they are as a family. The real story of Christmas, it's a story about history and culture. It's a story about the Industrial Revolution and about how childhood and the family have changed. And it's about how the U.S. has become more culturally and religiously diverse and welcoming. The story of the creation of Christmas is a story of collaboration, of what I call social innovation. Like almost all of our customs and traditions, no one single person is the creator. It's a lot like my podcast episode about the board game Monopoly, which was created over a 30-year period by hundreds of people. I believe in this Christmas that we've all collectively created. It's a Christmas that celebrates family and close relationships through the ancient pagan custom of gift giving. It's a Christmas that celebrates the innocence of childhood. It's a Christmas holiday filled with wine, spirits, good food, and good cheer. And it's a holiday when we wish for peace on earth and goodwill toward men. It's a welcoming holiday that everyone can celebrate. A holiday where all of the well-known symbols, like the Christmas trees and gift giving, they can be used in television ads without offending anybody. Where you can put a Christmas tree on public property without it violating the U.S. Constitution, although you might argue about what to call it. But really, Christmas is for everybody. I decided to do a special podcast episode because Christmas is my favorite holiday. We'll never know when was the first time that a society celebrated a midwinter festival. I'm sure it was before recorded time, probably long before the Roman Empire. But each generation continues these traditions, and each generation modifies them and adds new customs that fit the changing times. Each family has their own private traditions, some small thing that they do that most other people don't do. I'm sure that our generation will add its own contribution, and Christmas will keep evolving. If you can think of some traditions that emerged during your own lifetime, put them in the comments, or if your family does something special, please share it with us in the comments. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.